We're going to start the second day of our forum, and I'm really happy once again to welcome you. I'm really happy to welcome the Senator DAUBRESSE, Senator of the North Department. He is one of the nationals that is really interested in the digital world. So he's going to talk about it to us, and it's very important for us that the question that will be asked are at the core of the digital, because it is really important that those questions are answered by our national senators. And it is the case at the Senate. The Senate feels the time is really long. It is a lot more than the Assembly. So it's really a good thing that today we have the Senator so that he can answer some of those questions. And we are very lucky to have small numbers of senators. And to begin with, the Senator DAUBRESSE, so that he can answer our question, to publish reports and to suggest solutions, and therefore to evolve our problematic. So thank you very much, Mr. Senator, to have accepted our invitation. Thank you, Melanie, who's going to ask you some questions. She's going to ask you a question about biometry, and you know that that is a technology that is, as everyone knows, on the rise in terms of facial recognition, but it's also dangerous in terms of freedom, but is also necessary because we need it in terms of security. So we need to find the right ways to do so. And that is what the Senator has been thinking about, and that's what he's going to talk to us about. Melanie, thank you very much. André, thank you everybody to be here with us. I work for the SD magazine, and I'm really happy to be here on the 4th edition of FIC. Hello to everybody who is following us remotely. As we said, we are really happy to welcome Senator DAUBRESSE. You're the Senator of the North, and you're notably part of you worked a lot on biometric recognition, and you have the report with you, and that one is available on the Senate website. You all have access to this, by the way. Can we talk about the key points of this report? What do you want to highlight in terms of proposition? What are the 3 main propositions in today's context, less than 500 days of the Olympic Games? Well, thank you first to have me here. Those that don't know me, I'm the Senator of the North. I started 25 years ago in the Vieux-Lille area. So I know very well the General Assembly. I was part of the elections for those roles. And yes, we are the senators, but does not mean that we are that slow. We have maybe a little bit more in-depth. So looking for some sort of equilibrium. There are more people that work more on pressure, but I'm not going to criticize other governments. So basically, we are on this subject because I am some sort of security guy in terms of the Senate. So the majority that were elected, I work more often, And I followed all of those laws about biometrics since 2017. And since Darmanin Ministry is part of Interior Minister, we need to work more with those tools, with the law LOCMI, that gives priority to interior budget to 24.8 billion, which is like over 20% raise in budget. So I know what I'm talking about because I was working as a minister for social laws with Jean-Louis Borloo and Mr. Chirac. So Mr. Darmanin understood well that that was essential, so I'm going to get back to the topic. We are in a matter of freedom, security, and protection of the citizen, but the context is more and more violent with an acceleration of violence, all fields together. That could be in the family or violence against the officials. And you can actually see what is going on these days with manifestations with more and more sophisticated tools. As you know, we have really big specialists that perform cyber attacks. And today we are not protected enough against this. We did not work enough on those tools to fight this. So when we want to fight on those tools, we're going to face two problems in France. The first one is that we are part of Europe, so we depend on legislation that is European. And when the decisions are really strong and are forced to France, then we have no choice but to follow them, but we cannot change the French law in those terms. But it was voted in last July that we were no longer allowed to use information in terms of like prostitution, drug. We were not able to get some back information. We could not check the texting and conversation because that was voted for the rights of individuals. We were talking with the procurer, the prosecutor, and said, I'm afraid for my children because of those freedom protection. We were looking to find ways to go counter this. There are some like traffics, organized crime, but French court decided that they were not going to give that information. So I'm going to get back to the main subject. So first one is that. The second one is that we ourselves installed from the Senate, from the CNIL, that is some sort of police of everything that happens on the internet. And little by little, they reinforce the decisions that are actually heavy to take. So last Sunday, for example, the people that were doing the manifestation individuals were able to fly drones so that they could see where the police was, and they were not supposed to do that, but because of freedom rights, they were. So this is, something that we don't want to work with.
Pour voir comment allaient se déployer des casseurs qui veulent casser.
So I wanted to talk about all those things first off, because we have all those elements that we need to work with. We cannot do whatever we want to do because there's the European legislation and there's some sort of police that is named the CNIL that is looking over us, and this is going against people's right. So now you want to ask the question, what is the protection of personal freedom? The police is not protected, and we give all the guarantees to the protesters. So I wrote this a biometric report in the public space. We already had to tackle some of those questions because the Interior Minister has worked on it in terms of anti-terrorist laws. We work with the global security law that instaurs a minimum of laws so that police work together, different sorts of police. The question was, how do we articulate and coordinate the police together? So we tried to work forward with this legislation. And we have a deadline, meaning that we need to work with this, and the deadline is okay, he's talking about restaurants, so we're going to have the Rugby World Cup. We hope that that will go better than the Liverpool soccer game, but we're going to have the Olympic Games. And the Olympic Games is going to be on 7 kilometers long, 6 opening ceremonies, going to be 40 to 60,000 people in areas in terms of accessibility and capacity to ensure surveillance at the same time. It's going to mobilize tens of thousands of people in the police. And we need to work with the community, the committee of the Olympic Games. So we're going to need to identify the people that are mandated to be security people on the site. That could be police, private or public, along with the necessity of the spectators that will see how do we do authentication, and can we do it on a deferred way, authentication like not live but deferred, and can we go further with this? So I went to London. All of our counterparts over there, I met with the main person for London Olympic Games coordinator. They all answered, you're French. They didn't tell me you're Froggies, but you're very Cartesian. It's very square, and it should be this way and not any other way. We work in a different way. It's John Newsom. We'll first look how it works. We're going to evaluate how things work, and then we're going to assess. In France, you do everything very square, respecting the law. Okay, I forgot to tell you about the constitutional law. And if there's any issue, I'm sorry, he's going all over the place, but okay, so time is ticking, and right now we will not be able to have tools for the Olympic Games if we don't accept the fact that with precise situation, if we are not able to identify specific people with the biometry, we need to find a solution. So this goes beyond the report. You are actually making it go forward from now to go against time, is that right? Yes, I tried 2 attempts. I made one first attempt with the Lopni law, with Darmanin that says, I agree with you, but we came up with a law project, contrary to the proposition of law. We did impact study with the state council, and they were not really for real-time face recognition. So he said, if you want to put an amendment, that doesn't bother me. Personally, I am for that, but as a minister, I am not able to put it in my proposition. And I was answered that I was only able to put it as Article 1 in my law project, so I just gave up. And then when the Olympic Games law came on the table and rose the question of digital security, I put an amendment. And there was going to be a favorable vote for this, but at the last minute, I was asked to withdraw my amendment. So yesterday, I suggested one again, so this law proposition will go through on the third week of June. That will be co-signed with the Republican groups and the center groups, and because we are majority, I think that we will also have the group that supports the president and some maybe more, and that will be voted. But in order to write this, I have the obligation to find consensus voice. And what is in this proposition law? Well, Article 1 is everything that has to do with identification. Let's say, for example, in an airport, you can refuse to go in the port and in the security thing where you have to show your passport. If you want to go faster, you actually give your consent if you go in this little box thing where you put your passport, right? But for example, you go to Doha or China or Russia, they don't ask you for your opinion. So this is something else. You're identified with your consent. That's by default. And then Estrosi in Nice, he has he has recognized with authentication in February when they have those really big parties. With your approval, you can go through this area and you will be authenticated. But that was some sort of experiment, and that was with people's approval. The results were pretty good, but that was actually a way to test the algorithm and all those new tools. So what I suggest is to say that first article, real-time authentication is forbidden unless there's requisition by the law, or if at a particular place there's going to be possibility that we have a sensitive person that may cause an terrorist attack. and except if we have a really big event organized and we guarantee that we can ensure this freedom and security balance. So this is all in this report. This law proposition was put on the table yesterday and will be signed by the two presidents. It contains 9 articles, and to guarantee all of this, what should I put together? Otherwise, I'm going to be penalized, and I will not have the votes from the center part. Is that we have the police, a police officer, a police entity, which is the CNIL. There's an ethical committee, a little bit for like in COVID time. The council checks that all of those data that will go to the algorithm are not going to be exploited in different areas. They will be auto-destructed, like in Mission Impossible. And 3, the Parliament can carry on an experimentation that will be evaluated each year. And after 3 years of experiment, it will be decided if this dispositif will be adopted or not. Thank you very much, Mr. Senator. Maybe one last question. We have a few minutes left before. So after this report, before the proposition of the law, you have talked about the necessity for an authority that will check the trustworthiness of those algorithms. So we cannot go all over on all the explanation of the terms. Do we find all of those questions in this report? So one of those propositions we worked more on it after, some of the organization that we went to, for example, Thales and Sophia, and we created a parallel with what we had in France, even if PEMIA is not working directly for France. But on this topic, they are not able to sell most of their technology to France. They sell to Israel, for example. So the question is, in the black box, how do we do? Let's take the example of Olympic Games. I need to compare. So you go to a ceremony, opening ceremony, so you're going to put your face in front of a camera. We need to compare it with files. So how do we manage those files? The files today, we have about like 27,000 people that are labeled as could be terrorist-related people. So there's going to be 1,000 for extreme right party, and the black box that are, part of those files. So the people that could eventually organize a terrorist attack, when there's like 200 terrorists that get out of jail, there's at least a quarter that is going to attack again. So basically, we need to test those pictures with the files that we have, and we need to test this algorithm so that we know it is trustworthy. So today, Thales is giving us 97-98% of accuracy. So we are not going to, we use that. It's not for racial discrimination. Of course, we need to guarantee that, but the algorithm, we need to have someone that is a specialist on the scientific field with a judicial eye that knows how to implement that correctly, and will compare your face with some of those files, and then after that, the file is going to auto-destruct so that we don't use that file for other purposes. So same thing if we go to in a different system. In a grocery store, for example, if we take a picture of you, of your face, just to see, what kind of product you go towards to, some other entities can take your information and do some target commercialing, like spamming, right? So when you also look for international airfare, we use this technology without being aware of it, but we plan to have an authority that is new that will be able to manage this kind of things with, the guarantees and the requirements of French law that protect your image and your personal freedom. But with this security cameras, that's what we've done already. A mayor cannot put video protection everywhere. If you put it at an angle, you will be able to see in someone's bathroom. So anyway, we need to install this. Thank you very much to answer the question with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and I invite you to remain seated to have the rest of the debate. Have a nice day, everyone. So we're going to continue with today's program, and I wanted nonetheless to give you a few pieces of information. We had to make adaptations with the different strikes. All the speakers that were initially scheduled were not all able to make it, so we replaced that with other sessions. So normally we were supposed to look at healthcare journeys, but instead we're going to speak about interoperability and what kind of interoperability we can expect for the future. And I have 3 guest speakers that are going to join us in a couple of minutes. Then after that, we're going to have a roundtable on child protection and the issue of age verification. As you know, these are increasingly popular topics with a number of countries in Europe, especially due to new regulations and legislations either adopted or in process of being so. And after, we're going to have a debate on KYC, which is an area of activity going through a real revolution. So this will be a very interesting debate, and we will have the CPF, French Bank Authority, Modern Online Bank, Monabank, and 3 French leaders in the field of CRM outsourcing and KYC. So that's the program for this morning, and then I will get back to you early afternoon later today. So now I would like to call Stéphanie de la Briole, Matt O'Neill, as well as Anna Centeno, if she's with us, to join us on stage. So thank you, Stephanie and Matt. The first question I'd like to ask, first I'd like to introduce Stéphanie Labrioche, Marketing Director for Secure Identity Alliance, ASPL. It's an organization. Well, can you perhaps tell us, give us a few words about it? And Matt O'Neill is the Technical Director of the Digital Identity Lab based in Canada. So we work a lot of interoperability questions. So perhaps you could start by introducing yourselves and your organization, the SIA, and Matt, tell us about the Digital Identity Lab. Yes, so the SIA is a non-profit organization registered in Brussels. It's 10 years old, and it was created at the time by the digital identity leader, and among other French leaders. We have 4 founding members, German Veritas, Thales, and EN Group, and the objective actually was to have a forum, a platform that was neutral and as unbiased as possible to discuss between governments, academics, and industrials. At the beginning, we built it from the ground up, and there was nothing. It was not even an issue, but 10 years ago, it was really the very beginning of the discussions. And we cover the entire world. We have other members from other countries, associated members, affiliated members from all over the world, from African countries, North America, Europe a lot, a few Asian representatives as well, and we promote best practice. But not only, since last September, we have been certified by a UN agency, the International Telecommunication Union, and this enables them to refer to publications that we produce. So it's a platform a bit like Oasis in the United States, and we're able to develop standards as well, but we'll get back to that later. So that's for SIA. Thank you, Stephanie. Now, Matt, normally the microphone should work. Hello, my name is Matt O'Neill. I'm from the Digital Identity Lab from Canada. Please pardon my French. It's not my native language, although I speak it on a regular basis. But I had a lot of practice this week. But some English words might come out during my talk, so I'll try in French. So the lab was founded in 2019, just before the COVID pandemic, and the purpose of this was that we had requests from the different provinces in Canada, and namely Quebec and Ontario, who developed digital identity in their provinces, and they needed a safe space for evaluation, practice purposes. So they needed a lab for that. And that is the purpose of creating the lab, and the reason why we're here today. With the COVID crisis, it changed the public opinion, and the programs were modified, and we evolved, our mission evolved in this ecosystem to have a neutral space for different organizations, governments, and develop services to implement and assess the different digital identification solutions. So that is our role today, and we are a space where if you need to contact either governments or technology specialists and users to try out solutions, and we introduced a few services. If you need expertise, for example, to implement a service or a digital identity solution. So we have developed that kind of solution with a broad community. So that's the kind of thing we do. Thank you, Matt, and thank you for introducing and presenting your organization. So today, interoperability is a highly significant issue, and maybe some of you attended the transatlantic USA-Europe convention on interoperability and what we need to build for tomorrow. Stephanie, as SIA representatives, you are a proposal maker, and I think in the coming days you're about to publish a report on this topic. Can you tell us more about that? Yes, so SIA and all its members are involved in this and different pilot projects and European pilots. But if we look at organization, we started 5 years ago. There was well, we're talking today about wallet, but wallets work if there are repositories in place behind them, and those must be put in place by governments to have the data we need. And in Europe, North America, it's quite well organized, but it was not at all the case in 75% of developing countries, and namely African countries. And there was a real demand arising from those countries where they wanted to set up interoperable repositories and not vendor locking solutions. So SIA worked in partnership via our platform, and it really is a neutral platform. So we sat around the table with around 16 countries and 20 industrial stakeholders, and we came up with a standard, and it's a set of APIs that allow us to make different repositories interoperable. So it's before the onboarding stage in the wallet, so it can be population repositories, system repositories to create all those identity data sets. So we came up with interoperability solutions. So for government, it allows them to benefit the whole offer available on the market because there's no vendor lock, and reduce their integration cost, and it standardizes data organization. So there's this whole part that is not necessary in most developed countries because it's the founding part of the identity system. But what we say, what we claim is that at European level, there is one protocol that it has not been standardized yet, that is up to member states to decide. But we can very well use the OSIA standard for the personal identity data part. And it's specified at VCC level, but this part that is left to the decision of European member states, they could very well decide to use the OSIA interface, which is finished, complete. There's a certification and qualification program in place, and by the end of summer, if everything goes according to plan, it's going to become an international standard integrated within the International Telecommunication Union. And at the end of the day, we do it in partnership with the US, and we're going to publish a report that deals not only with interoperability but also with identity credentials, interoperability, of course, but also everything around data privacy that we spoke about earlier, so including biometrics. So this report will be available to the public, but it will be issued only at the end of the day because we're working on American time, US time today. So a SIA report with Kantara and OpenID Foundation on those interoperability issues, and namely for credentials. And okay, thank you, Stephanie. And we also remember what you said about the OSIA standard that can allow different countries to modulate governmental identification solutions. Matt, I'd like to turn to you now. In Canada, you're divided into provinces. You have public sector, private sector. What is your take on this interoperability questions? What solutions do you have today, and what solutions are you considering to use for tomorrow, and what challenges, what interoperability are you faced with in Canada? Well, in Canada, it's a great legal fight between provinces and the federal government, and it's the province's opinion that it's up to them to, because it's their field of competence to issue driver's licenses, so they apply the same principle here. So we have around 12 provinces and territories that want to work independently, So the federal government sees that we need a nationwide solution. It's plain sense, but there's a great legal fight and there's no legislation in place to cover that. So what they did is they came up with a certain set of standards from different organizations and governments to have a consistent system across Canada. So what's happening today in Canada is we have an organization called Direct, and they came up with a framework that aims to fix the issue. And we also have an organization that I chaired myself. And today, the name is, I think, Digital Governance Council, and it's an organization which mission is to bridge the public and private sectors to ensure that Canada undergoes a good digital transformation process. So they have a set of standards for data privacy, digital identity, justification. Then the federal government has a project with the council to come up with a technical norm of specification that directly addresses the issues of justifications and wallets. But the problem here is that projects go forward very slowly and with long delays. We published something last year, but I think the next production will be in 2024. And will Canada develop its own standards, or will they use existing international standards such as ISO, Credential, OpenID, or other known protocols, or are they going to create their own? I think it will be both. I think they will create their own norms and standards, but also inspire from existing best practice. But as far as I'm concerned, based on my experience, is that with norms and standards that I've been working with for the last 20 years, it's really going to be dictated more by the market reality. They're going to tell us which norms and standards they chose to use, and the rest will follow. Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you very much for your testimonies, and perhaps I'd like to, if you have a message to convey that you feel is more important on those interoperability questions, how would you conclude this exchange? The message I'd like to put across is that the best solutions are open standards like OSIA, ISO. That's the message we put across everywhere we go. Apparently, microphone is on strike. So what we observe at international level is that, and we spoke about it a lot yesterday, in the geopolitical world we live in, there's a real geopolitization on the use of certain technologies, open source technologies. So it's highly important for Europeans and North Americans to that whatever the language used, whether it's freeware or vendor software, is really to push international standards and open standards. And that's the message that we put across with all our partners, governments all around the world. And I know Yves will agree with me. Matt, would you like to give your message as a conclusion? Yeah, from a Canadian perspective, from my experience, it's always best to go with international standards like ISO, but the problem with that is that it's always a very long process. So we need norms to fill the gaps in the meantime. And the most important thing is the global cooperation to come up with standards that are workable. And perhaps I haven't been specific enough when I say international standards, and there's also what we call open standards. I wouldn't want to contradict myself here. Open standards allow us to move faster, and then international standards that take longer, and those can be introduced in big organizations such as United Nations. Thank you to the both of you, and let me remind you that Stéphanie Labriode from SIA, Cyber Identity Secure Alliance, based in Brussels. They work with academics, industrials, and governments. And Matt O'Neill was with us from the Digital Identity Lab in Canada, who can assess a lot of digital identity solutions. So thank you to the both of you. I think they deserve a warm round of applause. And now I'd like to call Yves Le Quérec on stage, Pierre Lartigue and Nathalie Launay for the debate on attribute attestation related to age verification and childhood protection. Thank you. I forgot one speaker, Florent de Lavallée from CNIL, who gives us the honor of being with us this morning.
Okay, so I'm going to take a microphone. Thank you. Hello, everybody. So indeed, we are going to have a roundtable around child protection, and teenage protection and minor protection on the problem that is accessibility of websites that are actually supposed to be only for adults. So you understood behind that. It is tackling the law project to have age control, notably for pornographic websites and technologies that are developed to go over this part, and those technologies that are recommended by the CNIL. And I thank Florent to have accepted this morning to come join us to this roundtable to remind us of the recommendation of the CNIL in those terms. And then we will develop some solutions that are maybe not always going to be remembered, but that can be working around facial recognition and systems of electronic signature, so the visible signature token, and we will see that later. But I'm going to first let everybody introduce themselves, and then we're also going to see solutions that will go over payment solutions with Nathalie Launay with La Galite. And then we will also look at what will happen on the wallet side, the European wallet, because when we go on the EDAS rule, we have the opportunity to see and use attributes through wallet, the EDAS wallet. So we're going to start with Florent. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and if you can remind us in some key points all the publications that were made by the CNIL and the recommendations, and because that is how, where we need to base our work to conform to your recommendations. So I am Florent de Laval, recently responsible for technology expertise at the CNIL, and at 8:45 I was invited, so I like to go fast. I want to remind first off that we have two key points in which the CNIL works on, and it's gonna in terms of age verification, the digital checking is the main question, and I'm sure we're going to go over this more in depth. And the second point is the action towards minors for sensibilization. And you were actually referring to a law in 2020 that pertained to pornographic sites. Is a law on which the CNIL is not the intervening authority. It is actually the ARCOM. However, and that's where we're going to start our main topic, is that it was putting the obligation on the service providers, pornographic service providers, put the obligation on them. So if we take a natural approach, what is an age verification? It will take us directly to putting an alert on what is personal data protection, because they're going to actually, the person is going to give his date of birth. So that means that if you give the provider information about your identity, you give them something that is not necessarily needed. And if you go through a third party, like a payment, it might not be needed either for your bank to know that you're using those sites. So I'm referring to a minimization principle, which is actually common principle, but had us think, are there modalities that make us be able to work, on one hand, protect those minors and work with the law and respects of privacy, whether they are minors or over 18 or under 18. If you go on the website of the CNIL website, you can find more information about this. 26th of July 2022 is the one motion that will gather most of the information. First is we say that what we want, to put it simply, we want that the person that checks your age does not necessarily know why you do that, and the service, so for example, pornographic site that needs to have this age proof doesn't know how you provide this information. Shouldn't know information that doesn't need to know. And another element that is extremely important in this position, the CNIL position, is the fact that the system that will be implemented need to be controlled and certified, and that requires a third-party intervention that is able to say, okay, so those things are checked the right way. So of course, there's more important things to talk about, but I cannot go over all of the elements. So it was important for the CNIL to express themselves. It was also important to demonstrate that it was a possibility and feasible in a way that we judged was ideal. And I referenced to a work that was actually published by the CNIL laboratory and a researcher of the Polytechnic school. His works were about okay, so you talk about ZKP. Okay, so for people that know actually this subject, is implementing a principle on one side as a user that wants to access a website. You need to have your age verified, but you're going to go through a third-party website that's going to be able to check your age, and this third party, so this age proof goes back to the user, because we don't want this information to go to someone else. So this third party, at the end, when you give your age, this third party is not known by the website. It is part of a group signature group that is able to check your age. He says, okay, you are over 18, but does not know how you check this information and to who. So yeah, we need to protect privacy on all ways. So maybe I was a little bit long, I'm sorry, but no, that's very good. Maybe Natalie can actually go into more details about this. So what's interesting in this, okay, go, did you want to add something? No, I'm going to let you continue. So what's interesting here is that we already have systems that are equivalent to the one you described me. For example, if I take France Connect, is a system that is able to check your identification. So it's in some way an anonymous verification. You only transmit the necessary information to the service provider, and this service provider does not know how you checked this information, does not know how you received this data. So I would say that actually corresponds to what you were explaining, because it respects the privacy in terms of data. So in 2021, we had, and the hype of the sanitary pass, we had a lot of protests because people were saying if you show your sanitary pass, you would share private information, whether you were vaccinated or not, but those identity data and this data that were gonna make someone be able to go back to your personal data and health data and so on. So we had presented at the time, but that didn't go really far. But we worked with ID3 Technology, a company that works with verification, ID verification. We had worked on a proof of concept to have a match with the ID, identity, and the sanitary pass that made it possible to create a QR code. So the person that was actually controlling whether a person was vaccinated or not would only see the face of the person and the result of his sanitary pass, but not all the other information, the private. And I'm actually going to let Pierre talk about this because his company came up with this proof of concept. He already uses that with other uses in association with face recognition. It's actually good that we already talked about face recognition because things are moving, and within the CNIL recommendation, everything is done locally. And I'm going to let you talk, Pierre, if you actually present ID. Okay, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to present ID3 technology. I'm not sure a lot of people know about this. ID3, so we work with biometry. We create our own algorithm. They are known worldly. We work with digital print and facial print, and we create identity. So we manage identity, we advise on how to manage this information, and today we are working with visible recognition. So we work with ISO, we write on ISO, we push the use of ISO, and we work on the and in Africa, for example, we have university that give students electronic token, and that actually creates a token that they can use, and it opens a lot of doors in terms of medical mutual security. So it shows a picture and a proof of that you are a student. And entering the university, you just show your code, and there's a facial recognition that is only done there in the portal, and that verifies that you are a student and you don't actually have access to the name, last name. So this technology, we can actually implement this in an apps, and so that it is usable again with a visible token. So that's actually the one that we had with the sanitary pass, right? So all of this technology is used again. And if we integrate this in an app, we very might as well have a facial recognition that is solely used with all of the data that was taken from the smartphone using the facial recognition with no divulgation, with no sharing of this information. And also it works offline. So that's really interesting. So if you want to go on a website, it's not offline, but it could actually work also offline. And this is, the main benefit from this. So this stays, and I hope that we confirm that it stays in conformity with the CNIL, because no data, all of that stays on the phone app. All of this stays on the phone, so there's no possibility for a database that would be used for facial recognition. So you want me to do live face recognition conformity? No, that's not what I meant. So we follow that we follow the CNIL recommendation in doing that. Is that correct? Well, I'm not going to go too far into this. I do not know your technology. I will be happy to study it, but on the means of evidence is that none of it is perfect. There's always going to be risks, and there's going to be several solutions depending on, the maturity degree. All of the solutions have risks. What we think at the CNIL is that the more local it is, the better it is. And if we were to introduce biometric data, what we do not wish is to have additional measures for the usage in order to limit the risks. Yeah, anyway, this needs to be within regulation and laws, notably, and also it needs to be in a specific framework with standards and certifications. And about this, we are also working on. We're also working on this on normalization level, because I'm also the president of the digital and strategy area in the App Nord, and we were actually auditioned earlier. We heard the senator remind us, the works that were made at the Senate. And the measures that were proposed in this report by the Senate in 2022, there are two measures. One on the constitution of learning files that were very, very strict. And then another part was the certification part, because the software needs to be certified, and there is no question that we would skip that part. Hello, can you hear me, Natalie? Can you hear me? Okay, I wanted to precise that the technology on the visible token that was experimented on the was based on authentication and not identification. It is a proximity basis. The person that presents his document has the person that has this document is the right person. Has nothing to do with facial recognition. This is, controlled by the user. And yeah, so if you can actually show the image that I wanted to introduce. So on my side, I'm a consultant at Galita, a subsidiary of Soprastia. And on the payment part, so I would like to make a transition on the future perspective, the European project of digital payment in Europe with proof of age. So this is a perspective for 2026. So that's going to be really fast, and I want to introduce again the concepts of this wallet, this European wallet. So you have two acronyms. So you can also use that name under electronic wallet. It's not only to identify objects or person for public or electronic signature, but also has a mean for attributes. So this digital wallet can have two models. Number one, it can have the type 1 architectural reference framework. And will require to have activated data in Europe that also have this name of PID. But all of those usages don't require this wallet to be activated with PID, or the attestation need to be delivered with this ID. So you also have ADAS2 that we call trusted service provider. That can be a high trusted level, quality trusted provider that can be provided by different administration sources, different from the validation civil state, but also private sectors. So this is where this is important, because the digital wallet can work online and can also work with payment online. It is not only limited to opening an account online. So you have other uses, for example, payment that does not require PID, because the bank will already have had the verified steps protecting the data of individuals. So you actually talked earlier the theme of minimization. And we also work in that way, that we all only need to give the minimum information. So let's say, for example, the date of birth. So am I old enough to access this service or not? So that would be, the minimum. So I'm going to talk only about online usage, but it is more difficult in terms of privacy because it gathers the whole usage, and the object of the wallet is to work with interoperability. The problem is we have different borders, different from France, and we have like people under 18 that know how to work with a VPN, and they can, hack those in order to go over this age restriction. So we're going to see how to work with the privacy by design. So when you start a payment online, first you have a vision of interoperability. So let's take a Belgium client is going to buy something online. So let's say, for example, pornographic video, but that can be purchasing alcohol or tobacco, or even some countries, some marijuana. So he's going to try to make this purchase with a provider that's not necessarily French or not even European. Let's take, for example, Amazon. So you're going to pay with a French actor, so that could be a French bank or a payment initiator. So you will first need to make sure that you are on the right website, because, that happens, and the CNIL works with that. You can sometimes be with a website that looks like the real one, but okay, so this first step will be enable the user to double check that he's on the right website. So that will be the quick certificate, and this provider can actually also give a unique identification number, an identifier for moral person. So from this step, the service is going to ask you, are you allowed to access this page? Okay, so I think I didn't actually really make any mistake. I copied and pasted your recommendations. We talk about age verification, going through a third-party verification, and to ensure protection. So the triple protection is to avoid usage correlation and traceability of usage by the one that is in between. And the wallet is under the user control. There's no federation or hub that is able to centralize all the connection data. Okay, so I put back your image. So I copy and paste. So that was something that demonstrated that it was actually possible to work with ZKP. And what's interesting in this is if we, create a parallel with the European project, is that a third party that is certified, that could be electronically certified, it will be certified by pertaining to some laws and different rules. You'll have a service provider and a user at the center that will control the wallet. You implemented a transitive trust with third-party certification. So here we work anonymously. So if we expand this model to a certification state that could be in a global, so if we implement this in the European model, I know that the European Parliament is actually thinking about authentication in terms of RGPD. You define here the ZKP. Know that today, with the European laws, it is not referenced in those big laws. It's only being talked about in the Parliament in the last March. I'm actually going to talk to you about how we can implement this in one of the formats that was suggested in the ARF. So the type 1 or type 2, type 1 was proposed with the mobile driving license that was defined with the proximity usage with a INCYBER format. The INCYBER will not allow the ZKP. This ISO needs to be reworked on for standard evolution in order to use, selective data and avoid traceability. But we have another option that is suggested and is also mandatory, even by France, is to use a wallet. And this vision is used, as you can see on the screen. They are open standards, as you said earlier, with a new architectural measure. Okay, so there's new ways that prevent correlation of usage. This is a transitive usage. The VCs are different from the VPs. What is presented is actually different. The wallet presents to the service provider this presentation, and the evidence is presented on the ledger. It's a governance that allows to display some nods to verify to check the age. So how do you implement all of this? The ARF has specified that pertaining to those models, the formats that are called JSON. JSON all by themselves, they don't, work alone. We have a problem in terms of ZKP. They have two formats. So those protocols have not yet been validated by the cybersecurity in France or in Europe or in the USA. So we need to evolve in that sense, and we need to find protocols, encrypted protocols to work with them. So the format JSON cannot work by himself. The JSON LD is already complicated, but the ARF has planned a new protocol. It's the web token JSON with a JSON web token, which is actually being worked in. So those works are being in progress and will come out in 2023 within the INCYBER Protocol European Forum. So the W3C has worked on a specific thing. I'm sorry, she's going way too fast. So those objects we should think about, they are evolving towards ZKP with no usage correlation. So I gave some of the technical elements, but I thought it was interesting. So you can see that this is still ongoing work. So if we go back on the payment program, I'm going to go back to something more simple. How do we work with this kind of architecture? So once we have been able to check the age, we are on Amazon website, we will need to identify ourselves with a pseudonym with the wallet. So second step, the user will form some granular choices. And then next step, you will validate the card. And in order to pay, he will have different ways of payment. So there were different conferences that, tackle different ways of payment. So the banking card is a little bit difficult in order to verify the age, because you have some, minors under 18 starting at 16 that can actually already pay with a bank card, digital bank card, a wallet, for example, XP wallet, or with instant payment. That will become very important in the evolution of payments. And that is account to account, and this wallet, a project with no intermediary, is one of the main project of the consortium. So it's very important, and that's a use case, account to account, that could actually lead to digital euro. And once you have presented your way of payment, the problem is the strong authentication can be suggested. It depends on the security level, and that could avoid some fraud today. And then the last step is that you can choose, for example, if you want to purchase alcohol. So you give your address without giving, more private information. And so his payment data is stored secretly. So today, let's get back to this. So if we end with this, with the European wallet, we have a vision of a high level protection of children. So that can be, different ways of identification. If you need a wallet that needs to be activated with, payment options and things like that. So we see that this is a great subject within the next 2-3 years. And today, I want to bounce back on what Stephanie said. We have open standard that is being worked on is the Open Wallet Foundation under the Linux Foundation that go towards this main goal. So we go towards something new, and if we don't want only XP wallet that manages your identity, digital identity, we need a European tool that works with security by design, privacy, and that works with child protection. So thank you, Natalie. The exercise was actually very hard, and we thank you. So what's interesting here is that finally we have a panel of solutions and environments that will, be able to be implemented and implement the CNIL recommendation. So that's very interesting. We have solutions that actually correspond to the CNIL, again, regulations, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done between the CNIL, the industrials, and also be able to build standards and norms in a way that later on we can have a certification organization. And what's the main purpose of this is to get trust in the system, so that later on when we have age verification system, that we are sure that we work towards anonymization, complete anonymization of data. So I'm going to let you finish on this part, Laurent. Finally, the respect of RGPD and the respect of anonymization. I don't know actually what to say more. It's very important to watch this over time. If I wanted to give the last word, and we see with the work that she's done with the wallet. So you mentioned, like RGPD and specific rules is actually going to probably split the work in little bits, and so it is a necessity. So yeah, those constructions that we can manage or estimate, that can be technically impossible, we see today that it is actually becoming possible. We have all the environments necessary, and we actually talked about, different sorts of technology, face recognition, and preserving data, that remains under control of the user. And that's a very important part. So thank you, everybody. I want to give a round of applause. And for your information, at the AFNOR, we launched 15 years ago an AFNOR spec on protection of underage and social media area. So you can work on this commission if you want to. So if there are any questions. Hello. Thank you very much for the interventions, notably the technical part that actually is really interesting, even though it's difficult to implement. We are digital providers, and beyond what was presented, I always want to base on the economic model, but most often, the people that are under 18 are not the ones that pay. They use their parents' credit card. So there's no debate on that. So the CNIL organization, we know that, but towards the end, and one of the reasons why we don't work with it with a big smile on our face is that no one is really clear in terms of like age control. That could be like pornographic sites. Because they actually tell us that are not ready to go towards that. But the government does not position in terms of price and who's going to pay for it. So only on the economical model, please join us on the round table. We will talk about whether it is more or less expensive. So you can come at 3:45. This afternoon, we're actually going to talk about this. Today, if I answer, it is the service provider that pays and never the user. Okay, but that was not the purpose of this roundtable, because we stayed most on the technology part. But indeed, I agree with you. There's an economical model to build, and as per usual, the economical model will exist where there's actually a gain, right? So it's going to be pertaining to the service providers. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Yves. Thank you, Nathalie, Florent, Pierre, for this presentation. We will find you in 10 minutes for a new roundtable with the KYC, with Bank of France, with Monabank, Lumines, TC, Via Link. In 10 minutes, gives you time to grab a coffee. See you later. Thank you.
Bonjour, merci d'être ici.
Good morning. Thank you for being here, and welcome to roundtable number 6 around recurrent KYC and future of compliance. You know that the clientele-related risks are increasingly frequent, and regulations are increasingly demanding with CSR requirements, anti-corruption laws in France, for example, with the Sapin 2 law aimed at third parties, and also with the anti-laundering policy. So with these 6 directives and coming European regulations, companies are developing wider KYC proportional to risks and recurrence. So to discuss that today, I would like to welcome Mr. Dufour, FinTech expert with the Resolution Expertise Council, Mr. de Rancourt with the Permanent Control Risk Management at Monabank, Mr. Jamet, Chief Marketing Officer for TC Group, Mr. Pancel, VP Sales, Bank, Finance, Services and Insurance for Lumines Group, and the CEO of Via Link, Mr. Sanchez. Before getting started with this talk around KYC, I would like Mr. Dufour, if you could please quickly make a review on the main regulations that banking organizations need to comply with. Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and thank you for inviting me to this roundtable when CPR is happy to take part in it for the second time, because I was present also last year. So it's a vast subject, so I cannot cover everything in just a few minutes and sum up all the relevant measures that financial establishments are subject to. But maybe just to give you a few elements of the corpus related to this subject is an accumulation of different legal texts, and the very first LCBFT directive dates back to 1991, so it's the year I was born, so it was a great year, of course. And as you told us, now we're looking at directive number 6 and the sixth packet of text, and that is still being discussed with three-way European organizations and authorities. So rather than listing out all the points one by one, I'd like to mention that CBFT does not apply only to banking establishments, but also the whole financial industry and as well as other sectors. But I'm going to limit myself to the financial word, so banking establishment, payment, e-cash solutions, UBSP, brokers, and also all insurance, whether brokers or insurance companies. And it was also extended partly to cryptocurrency sector, and those stakeholders also subject to KYC requirements. Maybe I'd like to emphasize 2 points that seem relevant to me and today based on this roundtable. The first one is that a fundamental obligation that is on financial stakeholders' shoulders is watchfulness towards their clients when they enter into a business relationship, when they need to check several pieces of identification, civil status, etc., but also broader data sets like income, residence for physical persons, namely. So, and the second point is that this watchfulness obligation is not something static. It's not just a set of checks or checking pieces of ID, but they must also be adapted according to the risk profile of the client and the client activity. And this is maybe a big change in if we look back on the history of CBFT and in the fight against laundering. Banking establishment needs to adopt a risk-based approach. So that means that banking establishments cannot just read and apply the text of the law, but they must have a proactive approach with their clients when they engage in a business relationship and throughout the whole lifetime of the agreement or product. And they must able to justify and adapt the measures in place by broadening the measures, for example, or in the opposite case, by lightening them up, if depending on the applicable case. But this is, of course, as you imagine, strictly regulated. These obligations make up a workload, of course, for financial establishments, and the CPR is perfectly aware of it, and it's also a big part of our activity, and it's not going to get smaller. And maybe the last point I'd like to raise is that these obligations are absolutely necessary with the complexification of business models and operations. It's very unlikely that regulations and CBFT will simplify even in a distant future. But this regulation is also being co-built, so with, for example, the risk-based approach in the application of the regulation. But as in its very construction stage, CPR pays great attention to the feedback and the input we get from financial establishments, and this fully justifies our participation here today. Thank you, Mr. Dufour, for this introduction and outlook. So we've understood that on the one hand you have statutory obligations, and on the other hand service providers or banking organizations that must provide user experience information that is increasingly short and dense for users. So, Mr. Sanchez, I have a question for you. So we saw that those statutory obligations have impacted and are still impacting customer journeys. Can you tell us more about that? Well, yes. Technically, we are more or less at the heart of a contradictory injunction because as a client of a financial establishment, we want things to be quick, simple, fluid. And on the other hand, those statutory constraint and legal framework, of course, implies that there will be a certain amount of complexity. We need to justify a certain number of things, as it was mentioned earlier, and it's perfectly normal. But the fact that we have to provide proof of identity, income, proof of residence, of course, complexifies the journeys. Of course, it affects and impacts them when at the start of when we initiate the relationship. That's the entrance, the gateway, and also all along the whole course of the relationship, because in a recurrent manner, depending on the risk profile and other parameters, we will need to update certain types of information, and this is where technology. So we are a software provider, so we supply technology. We are not at all experts in the legal sense or trade sense of the term, but we provide technology for our banking or insurance clients, so to provide them with the tools they need to deal with this contradictory injunction, where on the one hand we have a need to fluidify the processes and commercial processes, and on the other hand the statutory requirements that we need to comply with. So now we have artificial intelligence and other technical devices that allow us to conciliate these two aspects of things that were hard to conciliate before. So that's a major point, a major evolution that we have seen in the last 2-3 years, because technology has enabled us to facilitate and conciliate these two aspects of things. Thank you, sir, and you made the best transition for the next question, because we understood in the designation of this session, we spoke about regulatory compliance, and you spoke about technology. Now we're going to talk about KYC. So, Mr. Jamez, this question goes out to you. Maybe you can explain to us the different steps of a KYC process and how today we can better address them and even facilitate them. So hello everybody. Yes, indeed, we mentioned them briefly in the introduction with the CPR intervention, and again, we're not going to give you a KYC lecture, not with the time we have, but what we're used to is rather looking at them under 3 angles. One of them is the onboarding angle, so identification of the client that takes place when the client wants to subscribe or register for something, and this is more and more remote relational journeys, and that is a big change. At this stage, there are fewer brick and mortar agencies and physical face-to-face in-person interaction to open an account or subscribe an insurance policy. It's done more and more remotely, and this of course raises a certain number of questions. The second point is, once you've done this identification part, client identification, and the bank tried to, because the question is, when the bank basically asks you, who are you precisely? That is the purpose of onboarding. That's why we need several pieces of ID and data. The second point is the file that I created to provide the service or carry out the agreement. The question is, what risk does the client represent for the establishment, whether insurance or banking? And this requires some due diligence, where we need to check highly sensitive elements of information on top of who you are. We need to determine whether you are, for example, politically exposed, or you an artificial person or physical person, because from a legal standpoint, it's not the same verifications to operate to identify the risk you represent. And the third aspect is, it is a business relationship. So after the formalization of the agreement, we have monitoring duty where we need to monitor the business relationship to answer the question of how you evolve. You may very well be a low-risk person with clearly identified risk when at the start of the business relationship, but a bit later down the line, some things will change. Maybe you will start engaging in transaction with risky countries, or we will see unusual amounts in the transaction, and all this needs to be monitored to potentially anticipate future risks such as fraud or malicious transactions. So there are three main stages that are important, and the question to determine how today with digital solutions, AI, statutory evolutions, how we can provide responses to simplify and facilitate all this. So we need to identify the three main stakes we need to address in order to get there. So these three stakes is first, KYC is a complex thing because whether you're dealing with a physical person or an artificial person, the controls are very different with different complexity, with documentary complexity, information research, with the beneficiaries. For example, in the case of a company, if the client is a company and not a private individual, so the process is more structured and more complex, and the legal or regulatory evolution, of course, complexifies things because the law changes, regulations move, and we need to keep a watch activity on that to stay up to date. The second stake is that it's costly for the stakeholders, or it can be costly for the stakeholders. Fraud, of course, is the biggest risk that actors or stakeholders are exposed to. So a few figures, 61 billion euro worldwide is the cost of fraud today in the world. In 2022, 7 in 10 companies were victim of an act of fraud. So this legitimizes totally the obligation required from the different stakeholders involved. And what costs the most when you are a victim of fraud beyond the money, it's maybe the brand image of your establishment or your company, because you are completely exposed, and the main asset you're going to lose is your clientele. And this, when it gets there, it's really complicated. And the last point is that it's time consuming. It takes time for the teams, for the organization. Processing a file means tens of minutes to validate a simple physical person file. If it's a complex file, like for an artificial person, like a company, for example, it can take a lot longer. So these three stakes are key. And in terms of response, at TC, we're used to saying that there's an association between digital tools and technologies that are going to provide a certain number of answers. And then there's also the human expertise, because the complexity, the technology cannot solve everything. And there are case scenarios where we need to put technology at the service of humans to reinforce our actions and achieve better results. So three responses against that is automation and securization of the controls, and that's an area where technology can help a lot with artificial intelligence, so how we can automate more identifications or identity checks, for example. And another aspect is we will have outsourcing services or outsource services where the company can rely on expertise, management, know-how of KYC to ensure the compliance, and also by diversifying the cost, because back office structures are extremely costly. So outsourcing certain services can allow organizations to pass on the cost and reduce the cost while remaining as watchful as they need to be for a more affordable cost. So thank you, Mr. Jarmet. So we understand that regulations and statutory obligations, technology at the service of banking, financial, insurance organizations and their obligation to monitor regulations. And also, so basically there are three stakeholders that provide services to assist banks and other services that are bound to do KYC and other obligations via technology, outsourced solutions. So I have a question for you, Mr. Pancel. Can you remind us the business process outsourcing, and tell us about the necessity for a banking or financial organization to outsource part of their services, and what are the roles and responsibilities of each party? So hello, everybody. So Mr. Jamet spoke about it a bit just before. As you said, it's the fact of outsourcing certain low added value obligations for banks or insurance companies and get the help of a third-party provider. So these topics require a lot of know-how, and the implementation part is highly complex. So if we split the roles, so the service provider's role and the client's role, so either banking or insurance company for KYC remediation. So first of all, when you're dealing with such a complex topic with mass file analysis, you need to set a frame where we need to define the processes you need, inbound and outbound data, and define a strategy with clear objectives and requirements. And that's the whole point of referring to a company like Lumines, for example, where we provide our expertise and our versatility to gain efficiency by combining the whole technological part with automation and the human part with a high scalability potential, because people play a key role. You can never do 100% automated digital, so people will always come and correct possible errors that automation can make and be more efficient this way. Nonetheless, we need to be able to manage the volume effect that can fluctuate along the different campaigns. And the role of the bank on their side will be to comply with the various statutory obligations, and from there define the compliance rules depending on the clients and associated risks, but as well they're also in charge of the segmentation of their clientele. For example, in an insurance company, IRD or savings clientele will not be asked the same set of documents. Maybe some will be asked only a piece of ID, while another customers will be asked to produce a proof of residence, for example, to open a savings account. So there are many benefits to outsource with BPO specialists. For example, it reduces the cost. We're talking about cost reduction. We're talking about time-saving benefits thanks to automation, and also the possibility for banks and insurance companies to refocus on their core business, which is consulting. Thank you, Mr. Pancel. So we have a bank with a representative of Monabank with us today. So when we prepared this roundtable, I was asked a few questions, and I'm going to share them with you. So one question was, is there any French statutory requirement, and is with the creation of anti-money laundering authority, can it have an impact on national regulations? So hello, everybody. So before addressing those questions, I'd like to say that Monabank is a 100% French company, so don't ask me for a comparison between what happens in France and elsewhere in the world, because my daily reality is all about French regulations. I do have an opinion on the subject, but it's not my job. And the second thing is Monabank is 100% online. We have never seen a customer physically. So I'm not talking only about KYC and this kind of constraint, but all the issues and constraints related to remote customer relationship management. And this has been our reality since 1993. In the beginning, it was a lot by post, and now it's done more digitally. So are there any purely French specificities in terms of regulations? Yes, despite although Mr. Dufour told us that at European level, regulations are just a succession of sediment layers that has been piling up for the last 30 years, all national regulations are the result of transpositions of European directives. We could have expected that they're all transposed the same way in all countries and supervisors' activities are the same, but it's not the case, unfortunately, and I will get back to that for the second part of the question. So there are national specificities that remain national, either because we consider that, our scope is bigger than that of the neighbor, or simply because we have different ways of working. A very simple example is in Portugal, I think, at least in Portugal, but maybe in other countries, where the city of birth is not featured on the national identity card, whereas in France, the place of birth is understood as the city and not the country. So at KYC level, before getting into the scope of customer insights, we are going to save the place of birth under the at city level. So if we get a piece of ID where the city of birth is not given, then the data cannot be collected, for example. So without going too much into detail, so this is one example, and the further you get from European scope and more national scope, you're going to find more specificities, and regulations against money laundering in Colombia or Mali is not the same as in France, as you can imagine. And I will not give you details because I'm not knowledgeable on this subject, but we can imagine. Then you have intermediate countries for whom, with whom France and Europe signed recognition agreement in the different practices of information collection, and therefore we have reciprocity agreements with such countries, as we recognize that their practices are valid in our terms. And there's about 12 third-party countries like the US, Canada, South Africa. That may sound surprising, but it's the case. South Korea, Japan, Australia, and I'm not sure. I think that the Russian Federation is also part of that, despite what they've been doing for the last year. So yes, there are purely French specificities based on the examples I gave you, but I don't have any more evidence to give you to that today. Regarding the question of the supervisors, I'm not sure what that is exactly, but I think it's part of their objective to reshape the regulations, even though it doesn't simplify things very often, as Mr. Dufault was saying earlier. But the two missions of the MLA is to make sure that the different supervision devices are homogeneous, not only for subject establishments, but rather for control authorities. And from a French point of view, I think they already have a lot of obligations, and it would be a shame to ask them to do even more. So, and I hope that the countries that are going to line up on this supervision question, I think, will be more Northern Europe countries like Lithuania, for example, and I think we should look at. It's them that should be looking at us and not the other way around. The second mission is to substitute the national control authorities for big establishments, state by state. Here again, I'm not sure exactly what tomorrow holds, but we can imagine that if we create a new authority, it's not just to duplicate what somebody else used to do before. So just to evidence the usefulness of this kind of structure, we can imagine that on-location controls of selected establishments and major establishments will be done slightly differently from what to do today, although I don't question the relevance of the actions of the control authority. Does that answer your question? Yes, very well, thank you.
So the next question is for me, but I'm going to bounce back on the European authority dedicated to anti-money laundering. So that was actually a domain where the European regulation was rather different from the traditional one, because it was submitted to different interpretation. For example, gold plating, meaning that you say, oh, I'm really the best one, to overcompensate. So it is something that on top of that divergence, there was no mechanism on the European level to resolve those divergences that could exist. So this is something that exists a little bit more in terms of financial institutions. So the creation of the European authority dedicated to anti-money laundering was really warmly welcomed by the CPR, and the vision was generally considered as being really serious in Europe, and there was no reason for it to have its creation changed. And so the authority would have a harmonization aspects with more constrictions towards international institution, but that is still under construction. We don't know it's going to be in Madrid, Frankfurt, or Paris. Vienna is also in the list, but yeah, we're not going to go over this. But on top of this coordination mission, this control where the European Bank works. They are going to control the big bank institution, and that will focus on the banks that have several institutions in different countries in Europe. And they're going to, the groups will have to apply the same norms in different countries where they have banks. So that's going to be a progressive convergence. Okay, so are you reassured in Monabank? So as you can hear, you're not going to be impacted right away. Well, maybe not right away, but the parameter that is taken into account with big institutions. Monabank is a subsidiary of Crédit Mutuel that can be considered as pretty big institution in France. So I don't know how the authority is going to select different establishments and going to go deeper in different aspects. So talking about numbers, we will have to see, depending on what their rules decide, in terms of like, if we're going to be able to receive people that would come from Madrid, Vienna, but not from Paris anymore. Thank you, Mr. de Rancourt. I will let you talk again, Mr. Dufour. So we are at the ID&KYC forum. I would like now for us to talk about digital identity. We have a rise of this digital identity with the INCYBER and digital European digital wallet. Is it something that you follow? Is it like a hype that you agree with? Well, of course, short answer is yes. To develop, I would say that as a CPR representative, I am member of a small group that is called, I was created in 2016. Its main focus is to follow all the new trends, and pertaining to this from the beginning, digital identity was one of our major subjects. So it is a really incredible tool to join two different subjects that are difficult to work together, right? So the CPR see this rise of digital tools and is really receiving welcome. So without talking directly about digital identity, CPR had worked with a group of working towards remote identification tools. that can create a gap between the physical identity and its use online. So these were things that we have been working on for quite some time, and within the European framework, the right scale, ALS is a really strong regulation that offers guarantees that are the ones that are required to ensure the correct fight against money laundering, but also because those questions are very sensitive in terms of blind fields, balance within the European framework. And it has to be harmonious within all of the European countries. But that was an issue we had to face that allowed, business entries that were different for what was considered right. The CPR did not have the right tools to actually talk about the French example. So that is something that we follow. We've met a lot of stakeholders with pilot projects that answer, a need from the Commission, and we actually work with banking actors, stakeholders that are actually more Catholic than the Pope, right? To try to, again, yeah, in some case, it is actually possible to indicate that these technologies are seen well by the CPR. It has good reputation. The change of paradigm between the paper and digital is not necessarily bearing a risk in terms of conformity. Thank you, Mr. Dufour. Mr. Sanchez, we saw earlier that the fact that we outsource a part of the KYC gives access to service providers, like to a lot of data. I would like to know what you think about this through my question, that is, how do you manage the data? How is the data animated at the RGPD? Well, that's a really essential subject when you are a stakeholder that provides technology on this type of process, because we actually only work with sensitive data. We talked about it earlier in this reunion. We automate the processing, and we're going to analyze in terms of fraud conformity. It also subtracts some information like IDs, payroll, tax forms, proof of address, all of those documents that just mentioning them, we know that we are at the core of RGPD security, data security. So the fact to actually render this service, by definition, its DNA is like automation of this KYC. By definition, we need to have consulted this solution so that it is secure and respectful of the RGPD. So this, I would say, for some of the stakeholders, it would be easier than for others. We are also actors of like digital signatures. We already had, a state of third-party, trusted third party. And so when we built our offer of KYC automation, by definition, we built it within the same philosophy. All of those numbers are encrypted. They are stored in our own database, data centers, like, for example, Amazon or Google or other big entities. Only our workers work with those data. So there's a lot of measures that are put together. So apart from the inherent framework, we provided some guarantees for a SaaS solution. So we don't install our technologies at our clients. Our clients give us their information, and then we render, the processing of that data. So we give our clients the ability to we give them the right to be forgotten so that they can erase that data. Could be after a week or could be later. It's, all of this is really well organized. And for stakeholders like us that act on this subject is by definition the core of its DNA. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to render this service. Well, thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for those precision. We all heard about the remote identity verification providers, and I heard the process of certification was rather long. But if I'm not mistaken, yesterday there was Hubble, first company that actually managed to give this certification. And that was referenced on the Nancy website, Nancy French city. So, Mr. Jamet, what is your vision related to this PRID, and what would be the identification process? Well, first of all, what I can tell you is that it's a really good news that the first one was announced. It might unlock some of the big files and big issues. There were several that were waiting for this certification by the ANSI, so we are several stakeholders here that, give their application for this. So we can actually all be really, really happy that the ANSI gave this first certification. A lot of clients are waiting for this, and a lot of the projects are being worked on. As a technology actor or service provider, the projects are really there to implement this digitalization of the pathway. So those modern pathways will allow this identification step. The technology exists, and we just needed, this little push to unlock this implementation. So this is really good news for all of the markets. So the additions that we can foresee, it is for sure an alternative to many processes that are more traditional in terms of identification, verification that are based on documents. Because after all, the classical means of verification was to collect those, documents by extraction, and we might as well do it with automatized tools, and we were not able to go all the way to the end of this idea. So the equivalency, what we used to do in the agency, is now, face-to-face. So now is that we can allow this equivalent of a face-to-face identification remotely, but the way it is managed on the outside is we need to make sure that it is reliable enough so that we can benefit from this process through digital, and that will bring more benefits. So the second one I see is the way that it will be instantaneous. We are at the side, the point where the client will ask you to open an account, and by definition, if the solution that you bring is complicated, doesn't really work, is really long, well, the client is just going to walk away. So necessarily, we are working with digital solutions that will actually reduce the verification time of the identity. So it's very instant, it's very fast, it's really well integrated to the remainder of the pathway. So that will bring a new user experience. And the last advantage is that finally we talk a lot about financial environment that is indeed filtering all those changes, but it's multi-usage. They are very different one to another within a same domain. So that would allow to use all of those tools, electronic signature being one of the main ones. So at some point, we will need to go through what we could call an advanced verification step. So electronical paper signing will allow to have, all of this works towards having digital signature, digital identification that is strong to enable to be able to use all of this. So, okay, so this is all of what we can find in terms of legitimate certification. The certification benefit is actually aligned with all of the digital trust. It gives the clients criteria in terms of choice. They can choose, and base their choice on what they trust, because those processes will have been checked. And it brings a big guarantee of digital trust. So it refers to archiving of signature and regulations that go over all of those topics. The third point I was going to mention is the process of this certification, especially in France, shows the duality, important duality of the human and the digital, because as you know, probably the way that it is done is, of course, through a process of verification through the digital, but also the NC has kept in his obligation the necessity to have a back office to guarantee the technical control is actually the right one, operational, and is able to validate the identity. So that means that only on this example that is pretty new and innovative, we keep the main human aspect to guarantee the identity. So I would say, despite what it brings, it stays a brick. It is rather important brick. It is the first one that I consider as the first of the 6 main steps that characterize today full digital trust. So we would talk about first identify the client. The second, it will be authentication. So once you identify, you need to be able to authenticate the person. The third one is signature, to sign documents or transactions. So this is also something that you need to put a frame around. Fourth is trustworthiness for documents and exchange, because that's subject to a lot of fraud. Number 5 is safety of infrastructures and data. We mentioned it earlier with the RGPD. And the last point is to guarantee that all of this respects the regulation and rules that, were put by the regulators. So thank you, Mr. Jamet. So that opens the door, transitions to something we often attribute technology a lot of power. We overestimate the possible results and performance. However, I would like, if you don't mind, I would like you to give your advice or your opinion on the process of those digital process, the tools that users need. For example, okay, I'm sorry. So yeah, indeed, we talked about this earlier with Eric. So whether we are in a first-based relation or KYC, we talked about it also with Philippe, is the importance of the pathway. It needs to be seamless, simple, responsive. The idea is to not lose the clients. So this is very important, because we see that when we have a pathway that is long, because you need to give documents, and loading is long because it's real time, right? We lose a lot of clients, so it's very necessary to adapt the pathway. So when you're loading a document, you are able to ask questions to the clients so that the pathway is actually more seamless. That would be a very important element. I see two main subjects where the digital and technology is going to make sense. The first one is on KYC processing on moral persons. We talked about it earlier. The documentary set to handle moral person is a lot more important for compared to a physical person. The K piece, the status, the ID documentation is fictive, and so you need to go get information more precisely through different trees and structures to restructure the chain. That's a very important step. So you need to call for external basis via API is a solution, and it's actually a good exchange model for better security and will be able to give more information. And the second subject that is very important, and we actually also talked about it, is fraud fight. To fight against fraud, we have about 6% of fraud when opening an account. So indeed, when we have this digitalization, it calls for more fraud. And so we will need to implement, and that is the case in the PVI pathway. We need to implement algorithm that will have different controls to enable a more fine and legitimate way than what the human would be able to provide. And for remote pathway and paved pathway is actually a perfect example of this. I actually have a little question, if you want. You talked about a client pathway and the process and the optimization of this pathway. And sometimes when you upload a document that is actually really heavy, sometimes you can lose those clients through this process. Have you developed in-house tools to measure this loss percentage? Do you have ways to optimize this pathway? Do you have any, hints to help us? Well, yeah, indeed, we have tools to analyze in a few seconds. Well, actually, it depends on the client's need. Your client may need real time or, delayed time, depending on the granularity of the documents that are being attached. So if you need like the CNI, the MRZEP at the bottom of the document, it's going to be really fast. But if you need to go get an address, first name, middle name, third name, it actually requires more time. And at Luminous, we do full file control. We're going to analyze coherence, and we're going to analyze different documents. So the client is not going to really work really hard. He's going to put on a PDF his name, his proof of address, pay stub. So our company is going to analyze and highlight all of the elements that are going to help analyzing all those information. Thank you for this information. Okay, so we're going to go on with the last question that I would like to ask Mr. Dorancourt. It's actually a pretty vague question. I think that Mr. Dorancourt might ask you, Mr. Dufour, a question. Maybe it's going to bug you. Mr. Dorancourt, the question, how do you see the evolution of KYC in the coming years? Okay. I don't have a crystal ball, but evolution, I cannot formalize it. But I have a wish, and it's gonna, have us all agree in terms of client and providers within marketing or in-house. That would be great, but that's just a dream. We know that today we have solutions. We talked about verification, proof of address just now. What the text is asking us is not to check the proof of address, is to verify the address of the client. The law doesn't say check if he has an address, and because that's actually a triggering point when you ask a client. and a user experience. There's Friends Connect, for example, that will certify the proof of address of the client. So thank you. That's actually great to know, a confirmation. So ideally, what we can actually hope for, the client just, clicks on the button and we get all the information needed to answer all of the regulation exigence to avoid all the triggering, triggers from the clients. Because indeed, we do lose some clients within this first step. So if only by clicking a button, the banker will have all this information to have a knowledge of the client. And I'm going to go actually outside of the box of the law, because when you give, you grant a loan to someone, if we were able to get automatically all the data needed, and on top of this certified, because Mr. Dufour was talking about information collection, and then we actually talked about proof of residence collection. So today we don't have the obligation to get all of the documents. Imagine you're in front of your banker that tells you, oh, you should invest here and there, and he asks you questions about, the houses you own and property. You want him to give tailored advice. So within the same area, it's really simple. The banker is gonna actually thinking about the best solution for his client. He knows everything that the client owns because everything is within the same bank, but that's not always the case. So whether it's external, internal, buyers, providers, it would be an easy and cheap solution. Related the transformation funnel and loss percentage, that's a subject that is linked at the core of online establishments. We spend a lot of money in ads on the brand or the product, but the main goal is to bring new customers. And more we ask them, more we're going to lose them. So this is tracked in order to adjust. Where do I ask the question? Where do I place the button? Do I really need all this justification like documents, or do I just need to check some information to know if this makes sense? So this is something that is really on a daily basis followed through. So now, the online bank, that's actually their main problem. But when you in an in-house bank face-to-face, they don't really have to face that kind of problems. So if you grant like a loan to someone, you just have to ask a few questions and ask if they have like, face-to-face, where they have loans. But online, it's actually different because you ask question and little by little, you can lose that new client, depending on how many questions you have to ask them. Client is core of online banking. So instead of giving a picture of your ID, I just launched this website and I just film myself. So that means, okay, I'm going to have to let go of the microphone. So okay, so it's not that easy, you see. At the same time, I need to film myself and the ID so that the tool can recognize my face and link it with, consider it that the image that he's recording is the same as the one that's on the ID. So that gives, and I say that provocatively, it gives like some sort of glam, marketing thinks is great, but up until yesterday, we realized there's no, perfect solution. We need to wait for the first regulation. So yeah, it's actually pretty flashy, but in the end, it's more simple to download, or I mean, to upload a picture of your ID. We're not going to just resolve the issue. It was actually suggested by the Financial Institution Code. So we're talking about slowness, but since October 2018, we are able to use this solution in the financial code. So on top of the ID and proof of address, you are able to use this solution. In April 2023, the first offer arrives 5 years after this has been voted. So how do I see it? Is that the client just press on the button, everyone is happy, but it needs to be cheap. Okay, I'm going to suggest, okay, a few questions. I see there's 2 people that want to ask a question. Okay, Natalie, consultant at Gali. So we have different clients that ask for studies, conformity studies with different European countries, because indeed concurrence doesn't stop at the French border. And indeed, for a company that wants to develop in Europe, there's a problem, and we also have competition. I'm going to talk about competition with a remote identification. The French regulation is one of the most difficult to satisfy. In parallel to this, there's like different topics. So you have qualified identification verification in Italy, and you can have a solution that is ready-made that will be gathered with remote. And then you have BA that released a guideline in November, and I think I understood it right. Once it will be translated, the CPR was supposed to answer within 2 months to answer about the conformity guidance. And in those guidelines, it's just open door without control, human control, because ANIA today, with a deep fake and photo swap, we can do whatever we want. And they're like fraudulent people can actually do whatever they want. So human verification is very core to this in order to verify, a remote transaction. And also the phone can be, thanks to a malware or a Trojan, control your phone. So the CPO was actually supposed to answer this question. Today, there are instances in certain countries, some solutions, we need to stop them because it's not satisfying regulations of the CPR. So I want to know, are you satisfying the needs? Or when we talk about France, it being so strict, are we not vulnerable to competition because we are so strict and their regulation somewhere else, they might win more clients? Okay, so I'm sure that's a question for me. Okay, so I am aware of the EBA guidelines. I'm actually a little bit surprised because I didn't follow it myself, but I think I understood participating in the CPR, we're able to, talk about same issues. I cannot tell you how CPR reacted. Yeah, applications are not necessarily public. Okay, so it's something we were worried about it from the start. For if we want to talk in the right way of this, it's related to the ANSI regulation. Okay, so it's talking really fast. I'm sorry. I'm going to get back to it. Okay, it is true that the questions that we're talking about level playing field. We're implementing, the ANSI problems. We know today some of the issues, nothing is frozen. And I hope that the guidelines will be evolving, because in my mind, I thought they were, more exigent when you compare it to the former solution, because there used to be no guidelines, there would be no rules before, right? Okay. So it is clearly something that raises question and tension within the countries. Some countries are more strict, and the playing field level is different. And the scale might be a little bit higher depending on the European country. So, okay, so the question is actually not really clear. It's kind of a no answer that I'm giving you. Okay, so you still have a little bit of time. Oh no, the Plevit law was 2020. So, well, thank you for all of those exchanges that were very interesting. So personally, I have 3 questions. I'm going to try to ask them all 3 together. First one is, you can create a parallel between the new European control, the new regulation, and then the new European anti-money laundering regulation, which is promoted by the FISMA, and the agenda seems to correlate at 2024. My question is, do you see a certain relation between those 2 regulation? What link can you see, knowing that this regulation, AML, needs to harmonize the practices between different countries? Do those questions in terms of pivot will be resolved, for example? That's my first question. Second question. Okay, I'm going to give you all 3, and you see which one you want to answer. So the broadening of the perimeter of the KYC, I think that before we had KYC that reserved to financial fields. Today we have different risk assessments, anti-corruption, environment. We need to be careful to a lot of things in terms of clients, but also providers, partners. How do you see this broadening of perimeter in the KYC in France, on the market, notably? And third question is everything that touches artificial intelligence. I know that in some of your offers, you have those AI systems, machine learning, and how do you see this evolution in terms of innovation in the market? Thank you. Okay, so please don't fight. Do you want to answer some of those questions? Okay, well, actually, I can answer the question 2 and 3. The first one is actually tricky for everybody. So the good news is that it's actually going forward, and they actually go hand in hand. The funnels meet. So concerning the second question, that was about the broadening of the KYC application, I think indeed that what we can say is the practices that were for a very long time reserved to the financial structures have been able to bring back good practices for, good measures, even though we know it is expensive and we spend a lot of time working on it. It actually gives a good example, and we can duplicate those 2 parallel processes. Even though the stakeholder we want to control is not the same, so that the data corpus is different. Finally, what is the challenge is to manage the risk and a business relation, third party. So the third party can be state, individual, provider. They are all part of the satellite of the company ecosystem. So indeed, there will be risk because there are transaction and exchange and contracts. I also think that beyond the practice, the fact that it is going faster is that the relations with these different counterparts is also being digitalized. We can take as an example when we talk about KYB, so KYC is pertaining to the provider. That is more and more common. It's actually KYC of moral person applied to different providers. And within 2024, there will be an obligation to have electronic billing and not paper billing. And this will be applicable to all of the companies. So, of course, when you want to create a provider's folder, working with the Sapin law and also other regulations pertaining to transactions, we'll find the same types of checkboxes that you will need to apply in order to answer a good knowledge of the provider, the same way we do that for the client. So the second question, you talked about artificial intelligence, the opportunity that the IA brings in terms of exploitation of data. Yes, indeed, it is something that we use more and more. We talked about PVID. When we talk about KYC for some time, like for example, last year we were often talking about onboarding, and we were actually putting on the side the ongoing. And this is where that when we talk about control, verification, optimization, access to open data, for example, instead of just like using data that is existing on, the joint files, it actually goes towards IA or blockchain ways, brings new alternatives to access data from its source and not, access data from like copies or justification of identity, proof of identification. So indeed, I think that all of this, if you're integrated in automated tools, external tools, will make the KYC client more trusted, applicable to other stakeholders. We're talking about like providers. But yeah. Okay, Mr. Pancel mentioned earlier the IA was, you talked about one PDF that contained all of the proof of address, proof of identity, and so on. Yeah, IA is part of the tools, of course. Human would always be very important. I was actually talking about this earlier. We cannot be 100% of the files that are, depending on the joint files that you would receive, some of them you cannot read. So the human will be there to transform the 90% into 100%. Mr. Oh, I'm afraid your question number one will not be answered, so we'll have one last question. I wanted to bounce back on artificial intelligence. We had two regulations, ADAS and EML. We have actually a new regulation. It's called IA Act. IA Act. And then IA Act, okay, so talking about this, is going to talk about AA that is high risk or forbidden. There's actually a credit scoring that will need to be certified with CE label. So if we talk about, some cloud based in the US, this certification will be actually pretty difficult. There will be a certification with a CA pertaining to IA. So I follow this really carefully, and I wait for the civil court about the Schufa affair pertaining to the fact that the general prosecutor said that IA is profiling submitted to RGPD, and a general lawyer, prosecutor. So how did you analyze this issue, and how do you put it into application on your solutions? Well, personally, not yet. This is quite recent. What we can say is that we are in a situation that is rather classical. We can find, if we go back to the history on other subjects, there's archiving or such things as we progress in the innovation and provide different technology that resolve some problems that used to be 100% annual. It opens a new scope of risk, a risk plan that we need to anticipate and analyze again, and therefore we need to manage that so that this is used the right way and go against, ill misuse. So I would actually want to say that this reaction, this situation is rather classical of what could have happened in the past. We'll always have in front of us stakeholders and fraudulent individuals that would take benefits of what automation created so that they can use it in a wrong way. They can misuse this information. This logic is not I would say that, yes, our solutions will need to confirm some audit and certification that create a framework on how we provide solutions, but on the same level of archiving, whatever digital archiving cannot claim to do the right kind of archiving. And we need to go through also the right verification, authentication. We'll have the same rules applied to IA, and I would say that's actually a good thing. The IA needs to, we talk about trust here, so stakeholders like Lumines, TC, or Via Link want their clients to trust them and trust that they will do the right thing. But we cannot guarantee the end of those means. We cannot assume all the consequences to be trusted. Well, our goal is to be trusted actors, right? So please give a round of applause of all of the people present here for this roundtable, and I will see you later. We're very happy to offer a cocktail before lunch, if you wish, on the ID&KYC Forum Pavilion. Please enjoy a cocktail. Everyone is invited and welcome on the stand B44. B44.
Et on se retrouve à 14 h pour une nouvelle table ronde sur la gestion des identités.